Yeah, so first of all, I would like to share the fact that I'm very happy to be here. And I want to thank ABUD and Andres Reit for being so welcoming, but also being representing for us in Europe a reference with all the activities he's undertaking. Very nice to meet you all. And today we try to share some experience related to nature-based solution and their implementation into the built environment. The overall concept is perhaps well expressed by this picture over here, where we develop several small prototypes that use nature as a component of the build. This, for instance, is an experiment that we are running with NASA, with building 30 prototypes in Alaska, that try to face the problem of food poverty into Alaska, indoor quality poverty, and linking that to the permafrost melting and the bacteriological activation that this melting does. Using that as an element to be seated into different indoor places, creating better air quality and producing protein. So for us, nature-based solutions are those that implement living elements, as well as those that use meteorology as a part of that. So the coordinates of the work is to rethink our approach, perhaps debate about the word sustainability if it's still current and if it has value, or if we want to shift to a regenerative paradigm, which means take care of the damage we already procured to the environment. This is about restoring, but also it means when we talk about regenerative design with nature, using nature as one of the elements of the build. So we are shifting towards a design that is not apart from nature, but that encompasses and put nature into the center. This means also refer less to the paradigm of mitigate, which means limit damages, but it's about have a positive impact. And adapt, in particular, to all the problem we have seen earlier in this beautiful presentation we had. And you may find some reference to the topic in this publication that also hosts a contribution by Professor Andres Reit, and is downloadable for free in ResearchGate, and we touch upon the topic of nature-based solution. I would like to start with the coordinates of the problems. This is an ongoing research with UC Berkeley, where we're trying to visualize how changes happen side by side. For instance, here with its so-called violin diagram, where you can see in black the new hours, the new number of hours with higher temperature. Which are a big threat, particularly for all the living system. As humans, we have much better abilities to adapt to changing in climate, but the real problem is for the living system, for vegetation, for the greenery, and for other type of species. Also, our cities are stressed by higher temperature in mid-season, which means that we shift from that condition to that one, where already in mid-season we have very high temperature. This changes a little bit how we can think of vegetation as a protective layer, especially in spring, when there is that growth. So the value of nature-based solution as an intermediate protection layer becomes even more relevant, especially if we look, and I'm sorry for this is the last diagram, I promise. If we look at the one here, we can see these are all for the location, in this case of Rome, the translation of our from that were in comfort, that become hot within interior, and those that are hot become very hot. So all over the here we have these newer conditions to be taken care. And we try to, now in the presentation, understand how nature-based solution may be a useful layer to that extent. The first work I'm showing is a study for the city of Bologna. Is a work for a master planning activity we're doing with a local office called Mario Cucinella Architects, where we simplify and characterize a certain type of situation within the city. And this model actually takes into account of what will be the future climate according to the influence of all the natural element, as well as the metabolism of the city, as well as the metabolism of buildings. We can see projected temperature for the future. And we can also understand what is the climate within the building at a given time. And we can see how certain of the blue building, which are those that have less increase of temperature if we compare today to 2050. So the blue, let's say, are the good guys in a way. We can see how there is a certain morphology. There is also a certain type of envelope, and I will talk later about that. But they're also surrounded by, let's say, vegetation or greenery, which contributes actually to the metabolism of the building and the reduction of energy uses. But the main focus is this chart, where we can see these different areas, the historical center, the suburb, residential, industrial area, a natural and touch area, and the agricultural one. In 2022, we have measured temperature, give this charting, with air temperature that we can see in yellow increase in certain area. When we look in 2050, what strikes a bit is that the center is not actually the one that reaches a higher temperature, but we can see how the suburb is actually quite threatened by air temperature of 40 degrees. The industrial area, of course, even more, but also the agricultural site, it's very much threatened. When we look at on the delta, which is the difference in temperature between 2015 and 2022, we can see that the area that have significant more increase of temperature are those where we have natural system, vegetation or greenery, or in particular agriculture. And we can see also how water plays some role. So there is a high criticality for those that are the living system. And those in turn may help to secure our climate, but they need, we need to have a strategy. Why we have this type of diagrams? Because species are less adaptable to newer set of temperature. So it's very important to create a system that allow for irrigation, but also rethink the type of species that can live in this environment. So we have to have a transformative approach. But what strikes, we use this data and we interpolated with a question from environmental agency that allows us to understand what are the effect of this type of changes within the site. Long story short, hydraulic flows are very much reducing. You can see this in to this graph. When we come to pollinator insect, we have a strong decay, and you can see here in the last chart, of pollinating insect. But if we implement a strategy of adapting to the climate with newer type of species, and this is the orange type of line, we can sort of play and revert this type of mechanism. So it's very important to find a way to secure the local climate, to increase the thermal resilience in site. Also to protect pollinators that we know are at the base of all the food chain, as well as the at the base of biodiversity within the site. There are also current relation between the thermal changes and the degree of pollution, as well as in human health. And later, perhaps into the break, we can discuss a bit more into detail this information. But just to mention, for instance, there is a high increase, and it's a problem all over Europe, of skin disease and skin cancer due to the changes of atmospheric changes. So it's very important to think of how nature can perhaps be a filter also in that regard. For the city of Gothenburg, this is another work. We try to understand in a consultancy for them how and how much and with what quality the build could expand and how much the green can be preserved. So it became obvious to track and understand the building physics of the buildings, but also understand how different type of species have their own, let's say, behavior and thermal behavior, which is something probably also pedagogically very interesting nowadays to implement into university, shift a little bit from building physics also to physics of nature in a way, because this becomes a predominant layer. We can see how in 2050 we have very high temperature in the city of Gothenburg, both inside the building as well on the outset, and we can see how this has shifted or is about to shift. These are all calibrated model with the actual local measurements. We can see how indoor temperature in certain building may reach 40 degrees, but much less on those that are close to natural element. In a way, we can see how in this increase of temperature, certain topography, certain presence of water, certain type of species more than others are able to live within the new thread of climate. But when we look at building, and now I promise this is really the last one I mistake before. This is a bit complicated, but we have the morning and the day in the first part, and we have the afternoon and the night in the second part. Imagine the building during the day is able to absorb energy, and these are the plus, and during night is able to dissipate energy, and these are the negative chart. So the orange, the bright red line is those of the most recent building, which are highly insulated. So they are not collecting energy during the day, but during night also they're not dissipating any type of energy. When we look at the blue chart, these are buildings with less insulation, those built in the 60s. We can see how they accumulate some heat during the day, but they highly dissipate during night. And the latest curve, it's a building with a high capacity of dissipation, but also being included into a region with major vegetation. So we can see also how the envelope of the building can have a dialogue with the surrounding, especially when nature is in place. And this allows then for a better acclimatization. So this leads to perhaps this type of charting, acting with nature-based solution. It means then also to conceive indoor and other spaces that are much more connected, rather than this paradigm of a building which is isolated from the outside and has then a strong type of mechanization. Very interestingly also, despite for the city of Gothenburg is predicted to be 5 to 6 degrees of air temperature more into this 30-year time range. This is the increase of perceived temperature. We can see how certain area have basically the same color, this blue, which means that despite there is a strong climate change under the forest canopy, there is still the same type of temperature. So it's an interesting way to retain climate. For some time, I worked at the EPFL campus in Lausanne with the scope of study the adaptation of the site. What was very interesting was to see how the increase of cooling loads needs into the future is very much related to the most recent type of buildings, but also to their surrounding and to their proximity with the nature-based solution. There is an influence of form, there is an influence of materials, and so we provide the consultancy for that yellow building that you can see on top for Kengokuma. And we suddenly see also that certain areas, those more in red, need to be treated and discussed in a different way. So the first input we gave is to create a building with an envelope which is osmotic. So what I said before about having this breathatory system is then well exemplified by this type of walling. And we can see also all the nature-based solutions that are added only after we perform this type of simulation. So the building is not anymore and represented any longer breaking into the flows, but actually is very open to ventilation. And we can see also how the treatment of this area changed, and now it's all a platform with several vegetation in place. I'll skip because I know that Victor already showed me the 4 minutes. Perhaps I'll just mention some example that to study, this is a work with Bjerk and Ingels we did, where we try to have a building that also cooperate with a nature-based solution system with a certain topography, so that independently from the wind direction, there is always one contact with nature, and each of that has a different form in order to create a different landscape. Now this is much more developed in terms of nature-based solution characterization. But the building also creates and cooperates by creating this protected area from wind. We also did very large studies. We create a system on site so that we can materialize the wind and understand how this can also interact within the context. But thinking of natural layer, we developed several type of prototypes, about 200, where we try to understand also how processes, for instance, the drying of fishes to the northern country can be used as an element to create macro regulation. So, for instance, into this prototype, there are several inspiration from fishery. And these are all experiments where we then try to understand what are the impact on the indoor or possibility of creating a new comfort, as well as that lead to new assessment of how the comfort changes. In general, I would like to discuss how also practice and research, at least in my case, has shifted quite a lot in the past years, in the sense that before there was a primary focus in building and facades, and then the urban thread has become sort of prominent, but we can see how somehow there is this return into this interstitial laminal space that can be then characterized by greenery. So if you can see the array of type of consultancy I'm doing or type of work, there is a strong emphasis nowadays into nature-based solution. Some concluding thoughts in this last minute. The first is that we can think of nature-based solution for several factors, but there is still a lot of work to be done. This in particular connected to the thermodynamic of it. I was recently reading also one of the theses of the student of Andras that really tackled into the topic. And this type of frame also changes a little bit the type of people that we work as architect in our profession. So we have much more collaboration with entomologists, conservation biologists, ecosystem engineering, and a whole community that perhaps today is very well represented into this conference. Conclusion or takeouts. So living materials and forms should probably be centralized as much as possible, but with a deeper understanding of what are the implications for the ecological layer, how each of our project can contribute to biodiversity, how each of these actions can contribute to decarbonize, and how health is affected by that. So thank you very much for your attention.